Hi. Welcome to Artist and Critic. I'm Don Gray. We're going to examine today some of the effects of the breakdown of the tradition of painting in the 20th century on the artists who have tried to exist, have tried to paint in the 20th century, who try to exist today and try to paint today. Many people look at the wide variety of styles and attitudes, I should say seeming wide variety of attitudes and styles today, and see a wide open field full of possibilities. I see the tag in the ruins of the modern tradition, which lies in shambles with the shards and fragments all about us. From this, something may indeed grow that has more positive art values, that has more relationship to the lives we live, but it has not yet surfaced, or if it's trying to surface, it hasn't been acknowledged by the establishment galleries and museums, who are always behind the times, we might say. The difficulty with being an artist in our time is that there really has been no tradition to depend upon. And depending upon the attitude of the artist to that rather precarious and uncertain position, it has led to the downfall of more than one artist in this century. Today we're going to particularly focus on the French artist André Derain, D-E-R-A-I-N, who was an original member of the Fove group in 1905 when they had their first exhibition and were called the Fauves or the Wild Beasts because of their vicious, brilliant color, their wild brushwork, at least wild in the setting of the times, and their free, coarse, rather crude drawing. Matisse, Rouault, Vlaminck, and others were also part of that group. In a self-portrait by Derain, done following his very brief Fove period, which lasted 2 or 3 years, we see him under the influence of primitive art, Cézanne, and Picasso in the massive simplification of the head, the sculptural aspects of it, the broad planes of it. We look at the eyes and perhaps we see something of his personality. In the darkness of the eyes, a certain haunted expression. Perhaps he's already troubled. Well, of course he's already troubled. If this is painted around 1915, give or take 5 years either way, he's already troubled by the basic question of the artist: where am I going? What am I doing? What am I trying to express? And we see something of a slight hint of tension in the mouth with the set expressive features. But keep in mind the cubist aspects of it, the broad planar aspect of it, and the muted color. Color which is so strong and fresh in the Fauve paintings, has become extremely muted as he sits upon the emotional aspect of painting. Now, keep in mind this painting, and we'll take a look at another picture coming up called The Dancer, painted in 1906 at the height of his Fauve painting period. And for those who are not familiar with that aspect of painting, you can see some of the bright color, the broad simplifications of color and drawing, the simple massing of areas. Form is not really that solidly delineated. It deals more with shape. This is just the opposite of a sculpturesque handling of the figures, say Rembrandt's or Courbet's or Chardin's or Cézanne's in that sense. All right, this is Derain at the height of the Fauve movement. Compare this, the vigorousness of the drawing, the apparent commitment we feel in his attitude toward this style, and compare it with the later picture coming up right now. In a nude done in 1934, we see Derain trying to come back to what he considers a great tradition of painting. Now, I find it difficult to ally these late nudes with any particular tradition. There's something soft about them in terms of form, something ill-conceived about them, something kind of really sick about them, if we could say, in his attitude toward the figure, toward the female figure. There's something coming out of the eyes and the feeling of the flesh and the attitude that is not a healthy response to the figure as a human being or as the subject of a painting. The whole painting seems rather formless. The forms of the body are completely without distinction. The hand that rests upon the forearm is really vilely drawn, without substance. We look at the sharp delineation from the top of the forearm to the bottom, the shadowed side, and that is perhaps a hangover from the Cubist period that doesn't really work. That the head itself is not a convincing head. So we see something immediately of the problem of Derain. He's not able to go all the way with the modern tradition, the way, say, Matisse would, the way, say, Picasso would. Jackson Pollock, at a later time, would have great difficulties with this same problem. When he painted his drip paintings and he finally got them through to the acceptance of the galleries, where did he go from there? He reached a blind alley. Derain, 50 years earlier, 45 years earlier or so, felt that same blind alley. He couldn't go all the way with the modern tradition. And I'm not prepared to say that he is totally wrong in not following that tradition. I think those artists who were able to and had to do what they had to do, if that isn't too redundant, and Derain had to follow the destiny that was open to him. Now, let's look at this picture called Two Roses, painted in 1938, 4 years after the nude we just saw. And let's see if there aren't some clues as to Derain's problem, the problem of all artists who have had problems in the 20th century. We might say that it's not just Derain. There are scores of artists who have been destroyed by Picasso, who really had no intensity of their own toward the modern tradition, copied Picasso's mannerisms, his shapes and his forms, his sense of design, and totally lost sight of themselves and simply became second-hand Picassos. Perhaps Derain felt something of that possibility in himself, and he tried to ground his art in more solid, on a more solid basis. In regard to the Two Roses here, I think we're looking at a self-portrait by Derain, just as a house by Hopper or the shoes or cypresses or sunflowers by Van Gogh are self-portraits of those artists. And we can ask ourselves, now what does this picture tell us, particularly when it seems split right down the middle? A pale red rose on the left and a blue-white rose on the right. It says to me that Derain was divided deep within the core of his own personality. I'm not going to say he was a split personality, but I would say that he wasn't a totally integrated one, that he had no real artistic focus. He had no real artistic drive. He had no real emanation of purpose from the united core of himself, deep within himself. And if Jung is correct in saying that the left hand, the left side of a person, signifies the unconscious and the right side signifies the conscious, then in this picture we see the red flower perhaps relating to the emotional life of Derain, the powerful furnace that fires all our activities. We see it buried in the unconscious and perhaps buried too deeply to function. And on the right we see the cool quality, the cool calculating quality of the intellect. And if Derain had a problem, it was that he was too much of an intellectual. He was extremely culturally aware. He was extremely aware of historical styles and works in museums. He was not a bohemian boor by any stretch of the imagination. And so we have this sense of the separation of his inner passion, deeply buried perhaps, separated from his consciousness. don't we see it again in this picture called Harlequin and Perot, painted in 1924? Isn't this the two roses, again, the two sides, perhaps, of Derain's personality, in a painting that I find extremely hideous, to be perfectly honest with you. Let's keep in mind this one, because in a moment we'll look at a similar painting by Cézanne, which was probably something of a source of influence for Derain's painting here. But notice we have the red on the left, the white on the right, a sense of a split, perhaps trying to be more of a duality, in that they're a unity, rather, in that they're closer together, perhaps more related to each other. But there's something just ghastly in an illustrational sense of the way the figures are handled, the way they're drawn, the way their faces are modeled, the expressions on the faces. Look at the Harlequin on the left. Look at the stance. I mean, it's so commercial. Even though it's painted in 1920s, it reminds us somewhat of a contemporary rock guitarist. You know, maybe Elvis Presley gyrating the pelvis. And is it significant that the mandolin is over the pelvic area? Obviously, there are probably phallic connotations involved in something like this. But the whole picture has a hard illustrational character that to me, personally, I can bluntly say I find that I can hardly look at it, and you'll say, well, why have we had to look at it for so long if this character feels that way about it? But keep in mind all I've said, the awful expressions, the terrible posturings of the figures, and let's go to Cézanne's painting 30 years earlier. Look at the sense of statuesque dignity of form for its own sake, and form translated into the postures, positions of figures, a sense of order, control, and significance. We feel significance in this and depth in this painting by Cézanne, where we felt simply shallow triviality and really kind of a morally diseased condition in Derain. I believe that there is something he disturbed deep within the man that blunts his art career and comes out in sort of a ghastly sentimentality, as we see in some of his late nudes. We'll see another one in just a moment. Notice Cézanne, I've always felt, was a split personality in many instances, and that the drama of his career was the eventual unification of the opposites, of intellect, this time on the left, the white signifying the intellect, and the red Harlequin on the right signifying the conscious emotionality. And Cézanne probably had just the reverse problem of Derain, but Cézanne was a greater artist, or perhaps simply a greater human being. More courage, more daring, perhaps. I was going to say perhaps he grew up in an easier artistic time, but I don't think that holds water, because Cézanne was heavily derided in his lifetime. We know the terrible heroic struggle he went through in the creation of his art, not only overcoming his own personality, but that the opposition of the times. So let's go back then to Derain's Fove Period in a painting done around 1906, called The Pool of London, the shipping pool, the docking pool of London. And we see Derain at his best. The beautiful, crisp drawing, the powerful areas of simplified, rich color, wonderful sense of design, that thrusting bow of or I guess it's the rear end of the freighter looming into the picture, and a bridge in the distance. Should Derain have stayed with this style? Should he have forced himself to stay with it? That probably would have been as much a dead end as futilely searching through the styles of the 19th and 20th century, at rehashing work from archaic Greek periods through the Renaissance, through almost all periods of art history. Derain was literally a man afloat on quicksand, trying to find solid ground in these different periods. But if he had stayed a Fauve, no other artist in the Fauve period stayed a Fauve, really. Matisse moved on to other things. Rouault moved on to his overtly religious pieces. Vlaminck retrenched. Maurice Vlaminck has much in common with Derain. Derain was an intellectual, as we say. Vlaminck, who we see in this next picture, and keep in mind the quality of the paint in Derain's picture here. It's relatively smooth. He was never really a thick paint painter. Let's look at Vlaminck's tugboat on the Seine River, painted about the same time. And we see the thick paint, we see the emotionalism, we see the dashy brush strokes reminiscent of Van Gogh. Van Gogh, Cézanne, Gauguin, of course, influencing the Fauves. Vlaminck could not hold this pitch of intensity, and the whole rest of his life painted one single formula picture: a road through a dark village with muted earth colors, a deep Prussian blue sky with cotton batting, white clouds scraped on with a palette knife. There was something in the movement and something in the artists themselves that they realized that it simply couldn't be sustained. I mean, how long can you simply slap paint on with relative abandon before you realize or begin to think that you're beating a dead horse, you're working with a formula? Pierre Renoir, in his crisis in his 40s, decided that he couldn't draw, working with Impressionism. This, we're looking at a Derain painting now called Westminster Bridge, also in 1906. But Renoir felt that he had forgotten how to draw in the softness of Impressionist broken color and the feathery dots and touches of the brushwork. I'm sure the Fauves felt much the same way in their own coarser handling of color in the brushwork. We see here in Westminster Bridge kind of a neo-impressionist influence. And isn't it interesting that Derain painted a number of bridges? We're going to see two more of his bridges. It's almost as if he's using the bridge as a symbol. I mean, a bridge is something that connects two sides. He's literally found the symbol trying to connect the two separate sides of his personality. And I think these pictures are really something of his feverish attempt to do so. Let's look at a painting by Georges Seurat, also of a harbor dock area, and we can see in some of the sharpness of the forms, the neo-impressionist dotting of the technique, pointillism, if you will, something of the influence on Derain and some of the others. Let's go to another Derain painting from the Fauve period, 1905-1906, called the Blackfriars Bridge, which we see in the distance, a looming structure of dockwork and mooring pole in the foreground, and perhaps barges resting in the river, Thames River. But we see that same neo-impressionist simplification, exaggeration of color, and effectively done, but he couldn't hold it. By 1910, in this next bridge painting, we have another bridge painting, Old Bridge at Caen, painted in 1910. We see him moving away, Derain moving away from Fauvism, from the work of Van Gogh, being influenced by Cézanne and Picasso. That first the self-portrait that we saw at the opening of the show would be from this period where the forms and structural shapes are stretched. And that strange light yellow shape on the left side of the picture, looking almost like a face with two dark eyes, a blocky nose, and a diagonal open mouth, joining by the bridge to the woman behind whom rears this tremendous dark tree reminiscent of Van Gogh's cypresses, and we feel again a bifurcation of personality, the unity provided by the bridge and that central grouping of buildings directly behind the bridge, which implies an attempt at personal unity and artistic unity. We're going to look at a couple of paintings by Paul Gauguin to set up another early figure drawing painting by Derain. When Gauguin has gone to Tahiti, he, of course, has gone there to flee civilization and the negative detrimental effects that he feels it has on his freedom to live and to express himself. He paints the natives in this particular picture called We Greet Thee Mary, Ia Orana Maria, in a religious sense, fulfilling Western religious roles, and the Christian Mary is in the red and white pattern dress on the right with the Christ child leaning on her shoulder, where you see halos about their heads. And to their left, two women attendants praying. And even farther left, we see the golden-winged angel behind the flowering tree, capping off the religious element of the picture. But look at the solid drawing of the figures. Keep in mind the exotic native locale, because that's what's going to be happening in Derain's picture, although much less realistically, much less solidly, as we'll see. Let's go to a different kind of Gauguin, much different in style. Approaching the Egyptian, we see Gauguin taking shape to about its maximum, the maximum amount that he took it at any rate. Flat, two-dimensional, stylized gestures of the native women, as we say, much like the Egyptian. This comes closer to Derain's next picture, which will be coming up in a minute, but see how Gauguin has a sense of great almost classical calm, almost a totemic order, as of totem poles or ritual order. And then look at the strange frenzy in Derain, picture called The Dance, painted 1905, 1906. Obviously taken from Gauguin, just as obviously taken from Oriental art. We think of Indian art, we think of Japanese prints. The figures seem to be in kind of the ritual dance that many of Indian figures, sculptures, and paintings have. There's something stickery and flame-like about the picture that has connections, to my mind, with schizophrenic art, if you're familiar with it. They'll draw forms that seem to have a spikiness. We look at the figure in the left center or anywhere in the picture and see spiky grass, spiky, liney qualities. And I'm not saying that Derain is schizophrenic. I'm saying that I have a feeling that more than just an assemblage or collage of styles of different artists and periods, I think this reflects something of his deep inner disturbance, his deep inner emotionality, his deep inner inability to come to grips with himself, with art, and with the shifting, almost non-values of the time. Look at the blue serpent in the lower right-hand corner that seems to coil and thrash and perhaps bite the leg of the yellow-legged figure on the right. I mean, really, it's positively mythological or archetypal in a Jungian psychological sense. I believe we're looking at what today would be called a psychodrama, a psychological inner drama of Derain's personal struggle. And keep in mind the swerving aspect of this picture, and we'll take a brief look at a Japanese print just to give us a feeling of the one aspect of the Orientalism of Derain's experience. In 1913, Derain attempts a Last Supper in the style, as we've seen, of his first head of the bridge at Caen, in the Cézannesque Picasso-esque primitive mode. And we can each perhaps decide how successful it is as a painting, how successful it is in delineating and expressing the passion of the Last Supper. Christ, of course, the tall, central, light-clad figure, drawn attention to by the arch, and then the 12 disciples, instead of all being at table in a forced by a relatively square composition, Derain must place two in the upper and left hand corners. It's a little difficult in this picture to decide who I've drawn on a blank on the name of the apostle who betrayed him. Isn't that's probably Judas? I get help from the peanut gallery. Thank you, peanut gallery. Yes, Judas, of course. Perhaps he's the figure to the left of Christ. There seems to be certain dark, hooded quality in the eye. We feel like the hands under the robe are raised up to protect him from his own shame. The figure on Christ's right seems to be praying and resting his head on Christ's shoulder, and does not seem to have the guilt that one might associate with Judas. But I think in the few pictures we've seen about Derain already, we have gotten the message that we're looking at an artist who is trying to get his feet on the ground, even during the Fove period, as we saw with the Pool of London and the Blackfriars Bridge and the Westminster Bridge. And then comparing those with the dance, we sense a troubled quality in the man, because the dance certainly is far, far from a Fove work, as I think, being a more psychologically oriented work. The artists who paint today face tremendous similar problems. I think even worse problems, because in Vlaminck and Derain's day, if you had the stomach for it, you could pursue the modern tradition in the style of Picasso or Matisse, the Expressionists or Mondrian, and feel perhaps that you were accomplishing something. But who is one to follow today? As one artist, a younger artist, said, really admitted that he was afraid to go back beyond Jackson Pollock, that the history of art began now for him with Jackson Pollock. So you can imagine what floundering, non-solid ground it is for contemporary artists if they have that attitude. We'll continue with Andre Derain, Part 2, next week. The program's been Artist and Critic. I'm Don Gray. Bye-bye.